Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales About History. And I'm your host, Mike Allen. Do you have a sweet tooth? Well, I don't know anybody who hasn't at least tried a Hershey's chocolate bar or Hershey's Kiss candy. And it was all the work of a Pennsylvania man named Milton Hershey. His story, like many of the entrepreneurs from the late 1800s, early 1900s, makes a really good tale of experimentation, trial and error, and success, followed by incredible philanthropy. Our guest today to tell this story, Amy Ziegler. She is Senior Director of the Hershey Story Museum in Hershey, Pennsylvania. Not only does she get to go to work in a chocolate-inspired environment every day, but she gets the job of telling the history of this fabled entrepreneur, a job she loves. This week's trivia question, the question is, you're familiar with the radio call letters like WCBS or on the West Coast, KCBS, but what would I be referring to if the call letters were W5DX or NJ1Q? Stay tuned after the main program for the answer. That'll give you the topic for next week's show. There are some products in the U.S. that are closely associated, if not exactly the same, as the inventor's name. For example, think of Tom Carvel. He invented the formula for Carvel ice cream. And then there was Sylvester Graham, who invented the graham cracker. And, of course, there were the 7 Italian immigrants of the Jacuzzi family that invented, well, you know, the jacuzzi. Very few have had such a dominance and an association with their product as Milton Snavely Hershey, inventor of the humble Hershey chocolate bar and Hershey Kisses. Now, many entrepreneurs in the 18 and 1900s in the U.S. have bigger-than-life types of stories, and Milton Hershey is certainly among them, near the top, as a matter of fact. He even has an entire town named after him, Hershey, Pennsylvania, which started as the company town that he created and built. Now, you've heard of business people creating housing for their workers and other amenities. In fact, I've done a couple of episodes on some of them. But few took it to the level that Milton Hershey did about 100 years ago, back in the early 1900s. He started a bank, one with low interest rates for his employees. He had affordable housing, streetcars for transportation, churches, schools, an amusement park, libraries, and yes, even a cemetery. And yet the Hershey's chocolate bar was not his first confectionery creation. In fact, Milton Hershey started off in the caramel business, but pivoted to get into chocolate. Well, here to tell us the unbelievable story of Milton Hershey is Amy Ziegler, Senior Director of the Hershey Story Museum in Hershey, Pennsylvania. I would be very interested in knowing how Milton Hershey got into this. I mean, here we have a guy who didn't get beyond 4th grade when he went out and, started apprenticing and did a couple of things, and his mom finally got him set up with an apprenticeship, I guess, in the confectioner area. And then he starts looking into caramels and how to make them with fresh milk, and he starts this caramel company, and lo and behold, we could all be eating Hershey caramels today as opposed to Hershey chocolate. What happened?
He failed twice in Philadelphia and New York City and traveled around a lot before he ended up back in Lancaster. And during his travels, he did learn how to make caramels with fresh milk and opened the Lancaster Caramel Company. He was struggling a bit in the very beginning, and then he received an order from an importer-exporter in England, and he wanted a very large amount of caramels to be shipped to England, and that was really the turning point.
So now he is doing so well, he's starting to make a lot of money, he's got a lot of workers, and in 1893, there's an exposition out in Chicago, and he's learning about this luxury item called chocolate, and it kind of grabbed his attention, didn't it?
Yeah, and I would say when he was in Philadelphia with his first business in 1876, the centennial was happening there. And there were also chocolate manufacturers exhibiting at that World's Fair. So I think that he kind of was already aware of things. And the story goes that he visited the Columbian Exposition then in 1893 with his cousin and made the announcement that caramels were a fad, but chocolate was permanent, and he was going to make chocolate. And so he bought his first 2 pieces of equipment, while he was in Chicago, had them shipped back to Lancaster, and then immediately ordered two more pieces of equipment. And then he set up a space inside his caramel company, and he started to experiment with chocolate products. And at this point, he was really focused on dark chocolates, and he had a very extensive line of chocolate novelties that were in very fancy shapes and packaging, over 114 different options. And so that was kind of how he got into the chocolate business. But the whole time he was making that, he was also kind of experimenting with milk chocolate recipes.
He starts right at the turn of the century putting out this thing called a Hershey's chocolate bar. Within the decade, he's on to Kisses and Hershey's with almonds. I didn't personally realize they were around for that long. That's pretty impressive.
Yes, they were very early on in his thing. And I should mention that he was experimenting with milk chocolate recipes. The bar that he was making in 1900 was not the final recipe that he started using, but he broke ground for the chocolate factory in Hershey, Pennsylvania in 1903. And when he broke ground, he still hadn't come up with the final recipe. So that was really a huge risk for him. And then eventually the factory opened in 1905, and then he had worked it out.
Now, when you talk about the factory, this is in the middle of farmland, and anybody who's never been to that section of Pennsylvania, while it's certainly more built up now, and Hershey itself, of course, is quite built up, but back in those days, he was kind of in the middle of just open dairy land, wasn't he?
Yes. Milk chocolate's three main ingredients are cocoa beans, which are not grown in this country and never would be. Those always needed to be imported. Sugar, he was using beet sugar at that time from Europe, and milk. And milk is really hard to transport. It was before refrigerated train cars, and so it was really beneficial for him to be located around dairy farms. And he bought up a lot of dairy farms in the area before he broke ground for the factory to prepare for having his needs met.
We've often heard entrepreneurs who came up and wanted to do something for their employees, get them housing or give them some sort of better working conditions or something to attract a workforce. With Milton Hershey, it went to an entirely new level. And it's very impressive what he did. And I think it's interesting, you said before we started recording, that he had decided early on in life that if you had money, you should do something with it while you're still alive. And he went on this campaign to build one heck of a company village in Hershey, didn't he?
Yes. So he started with the factory, and then within the first 10 years, he really had a big plan and knew what he wanted to do. Some things took a little bit longer than others, but in 1906, he opened what has become Hershey Park. At the time, it was a green space with a meandering creek. There was a children's playground area, a band shell, a skating rink, and lots of fun activities. He built a trolley system. He provided schools, a bank. He owned all the utilities in the area. He built homes, really tried to make them all look kind of different from each other. He didn't want it to look like cookie cutter houses where everything was the same. And then I mentioned I work for the Hershey Story Museum. That was opened during the 1930s as the Hershey American Indian Museum. He was very interested in providing educational and cultural opportunities to people in town. If they couldn't travel to learn about certain things, he wanted to bring those things to Hershey. In 1933, he opened Hershey Theater, which is an incredibly beautiful theater, especially when you consider the size of the town that it's in. It's really stunning, to bring in Broadway shows, and they showed movies there, and that's just been a staple in the community since then. He also opened Hershey Botanical Garden. It was originally a 3.5-acre rose garden that's grown to 23.5 acres. So he did all of these things to make sure that he had employees who weren't just, working hard, but they were happy, well-educated. He wanted them to want to live here, not to feel like they were trapped.
One of the things I read, which sounded really forward for the time, is that the bank that he set up was offering low interest rates to businesses and homeowners so they could get a leg up and get into their facilities sooner. Is that true?
Yes, correct. Unlike a lot of company towns, he encouraged people to own their own homes. So he really encouraged people to be entrepreneurial. He wasn't the only one that was allowed to do that in his town.
Milton Hershey was married, but he and his wife, I guess, struggled to have children. And one of the things he did, probably perhaps his signature contribution to the community was what was called at the time the Hershey Industrial School. Can you tell us the story behind that?
He always said it was Kitty's idea, his wife. As you mentioned, they were unable to have children, and he really wanted to provide a home environment for kids. Boys were exclusively accepted at the beginning of the school because he felt that it was easier to place girl orphans than it was to place boys. And so he focused on boys and teaching them a trade. And basically, they provide for every need that a child has: medical, clothing, schooling, currently, technology and all of that kind of stuff. So it's a really incredible place that takes care of children in a family environment. So they live in student homes with between 8 and 12 students. They have married couples as house parents. And the student homes are broken up by, I think the kids all have to be within 2 or 3 years of age. Boys live in, boy homes, girls live in girl homes, and that kind of thing. So it really is meant to be a family environment and not just children living in dorm rooms or things like that. And that's always been the case since the school opened in 1909.
And it's still going on, isn't it?
It is, yes.
I had read somewhere where they had 2,000 enrollees as recently as 2016. Does that sound about right?
Yes, they do have a little over 2,000 students enrolled currently.
Amazing. Now, with all that Milton Hershey did, it almost all came to an end in 1912. He was in Europe with his wife, and they had bought a first-class stateroom ticket through the White Star Line to go on the maiden voyage of the Titanic. What happened?
He had to leave early to come home for work. So his wife stayed behind in Europe, and he traveled home on the America, which was the ship that radioed the Titanic about icebergs. So it was a very close call when you think about all that happened building-wise in Hershey after 1912. It would have been a really very different place.
Now, he comes back, he turns 60, and he decides that he's going to bring his business and personal affairs into some sort of order and create something called the Milton Hershey School Trust. If you could, without going into great detail, kind of explain how significant this was and what it did.
It was incredibly significant. So the school had been established in 1909, and then in 1918, he took his holdings in the chocolate company, mostly his entire fortune at that point. It was about $60 million, and he put it into a trust for Milton Hershey School in order for them to operate in perpetuity. He was going to be living later in an apartment in his mansion that he would eventually give to the country club. So he was very simple. His home was beautiful. It was not over the top for someone of his level of wealth. And so he always kind of had this feeling that when you became so rich that you couldn't spend all of your money, it was time to start giving it away. And I think he could have waited until he died, but in his mind, there was no point in that. If he didn't need it now and the boys could use it at the time, it was much more important to him to do that at the time. And the most significant part to me, and it's one of my favorite stories about Milton Hershey, is that he didn't tell anyone that he did it. It was not publicized. It was very quiet, and it didn't come out until, I believe, 1924. There was an article in the New York Times saying that he did it, and he was really criticized by a lot of people who said, "You're throwing your money away." At the time, in order to get into the school, you had to be an orphan, and they said that orphans were there weren't going to be orphans in the future like there are today. You won't have any kids to go to this school. And, they thought it was just a really poor decision on his part. It's lucky for us that he never really listened to critics like that.
Now, the other thing that he did, if I have it right, is that he also transferred the majority of voting shares in the Hershey Company to that trust. Is that true?
Yes. So the trust owns about, I believe, in the 30%-ish range of stock, but they own Class B stock that has more votes per share than normal stock. And so they own close to 80% of the voting rights. So the Milton Hershey School Trust, in effect, owns the chocolate company.
Okay. And they also, if I understand it right, have 100% control of something called Hershey Entertainment and Resorts, which is the Hotel Hershey and Hershey Park, I guess the amusement park?
Yep. They own various hotels and some restaurants in town, and they do own that. So those companies support Milton Hershey School.
The other important thing that happened was 1935, and in fact, you're now working in this group as well. The Milton Hershey Foundation, which was separate from the trust. This is where it gets a little bit complicated, but this was a charitable foundation, so he had more money that at age 78 that he wanted to make sure went to good causes. Could you explain what the foundation does?
Yeah, correct. So he did accumulate more stock in the chocolate company between 1918 and 1935. And so he took 5,000 shares of chocolate company stock and put it into a trust for the M.S. Hershey Foundation. And its mission is to provide educational and cultural resources in Derry Township, which is the area that encompasses Hershey. And currently, what we do is we operate the Hershey Story Museum, Hershey Gardens, the Hershey Theater, and Hershey Community Archives.
Now, one of the things that you often hear when you go through these stories of these entrepreneurs who created corporate towns and benefits and paternalism for employees, there's sometimes a bump in the road. And this occurred for Milton Hershey late in his life. He's, I guess, 80 years old in 1937, and there's a strike. Could you tell us that story?
Yes. So in 1937, there were a few things going on. At the time, there were no grievance procedures within the chocolate company. Men were making a lot more than women. Periodically, there would be layoffs during the summer season. They didn't have as much work to do, and so people would get laid off, and they didn't love that. And also, he was building a lot of amenities in town, and, like the Hotel Hershey and Hershey Theater were very nice places, and not all of his employees could afford to take advantage of them. And so there was that kind of going on in the background. Also in 1937, there were a lot of organizing drives happening around the country. Locally, that was happening with the CIO, the Committee for Industrial Organizations. They were organizing around Bethlehem Steel. And so they visited Hershey and they started talking to employees about organizing. And so that's kind of how that got started. Eventually, they had a vote and the CIO won, and then the company tried to do a pay raise, but it was unequal between men and women. And also they laid off some people earlier than they normally would. And the union organizers saw this as an attack on people who wanted to be in the union, because a lot of people involved in that were involved in these layoffs. And so that kind of started the strike that happened in April of that year. And numbers range from 200 to 1,000. We don't really know how many people were sitting in the factory, but it was a sit-down strike. It lasted about 5 days, I believe. As you can imagine, there were a lot of farmers who sold milk to the chocolate company, and that's not something that can sit around and wait for the strike to end. So there were a lot of loyalist workers in the factory, as well as loyal farmers, who had kind of been organizing during the sit-down strike and having rallies, and people were really getting worked up. And so what happened was the loyalists stormed the factory, went after the people inside, and they were forced when they left to kind of walk a gauntlet of people who were throwing things at them, and they were not treated well. And what's interesting to me, I've done some research on this, and what's interesting to me is the strike happened, and that was not an uncommon thing in 1937, but after the strike, there was recovery, and it didn't take a very long time. I mean, certainly there were people who weren't treated, I'm sure, very well when they came back. But for the most part, the company welcomed most of them back to work. They eventually created a company-run union, which the National Labor Relations Board declared illegal, because companies can't have their workers organized by a union that they run. It kind of runs counter to the whole point of unions. So that was found to be illegal. And then eventually the workers voted almost overwhelmingly for an American Federation of Labor union. That moment was really an important moment in the history of the town, because it could have gone one of two ways. It could have continued to be divisive, and there were families that were really ripped apart because of this. Or there was this sort of unwritten social contract between the chocolate company, the union, and people who lived in the community. And they really realized that this town was a beautiful place with a lot to offer. And if they were constantly antagonizing each other, it could never be that way. And so they all really felt that it benefited them all for them to be cooperative and work together.
When you talk about a quick recovery, it was only a few years later when World War II broke out. And this is a fascinating chapter of the Hershey Chocolate Company. The military needed some way to keep the troops going in terms of needing energy, which a chocolate bar could provide, but they didn't want it to be too good. Could you explain the story behind the Ration D bars and then the tropical chocolate bars?
Sure. So during World War I, Hershey contributed a lot of chocolate, sold a lot of chocolate to be used by soldiers, but it was regular chocolate and it was very tasty. And so they either ate it or handed it out to children along the way. And so the Army realized that they needed something that would have a high caloric value, but taste, according to the Army, no better than a boiled potato, because the purpose of this would be to be an emergency ration. They didn't want them to eat it before they really, really needed it. Army visited the president of the company, who immediately went to Milton Hershey to say, hey, they're looking for us to do this. Milton Hershey was very interested in doing that. And so they created a special paste. It was much, much thicker than normal milk chocolate. It had to be like hand molded because they couldn't pour it through a machine like they did for milk chocolate. So they completely changed their production facilities around these field ration D bars. Eventually, we did join, World War II, and they contributed over 3 billion ration D bars. They were testing them in like the Philippines and Texas and Hawaii because they didn't want it to melt, because that was another problem. If they were carrying these around in their shirt pockets, they would melt. So they needed something that would last in high heat.
Now, right after the war, Milton Hershey, 88 years old, as you say, his wife has already passed away. He now passes away. And yet, from the grave, all that he did during life to set this up gives one more gigantic gift to the state of Pennsylvania, or the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, in 1963. Can you tell us about this medical center?
Milton Hershey School had a surplus of income, and they were looking for a way to use it that would benefit children, that would, have been something that Milton Hershey would want to do. And so they came up with the idea of building a College of Medicine and teaching hospital in Hershey. And they approached Penn State University and said, if we give you $50 million, would you be interested in building this College of Medicine? And they, of course, said absolutely yes.
And so from the grave, Milton Hershey's money, made from the humble chocolate bar that he created, continues to finance philanthropic activities throughout the town of Hershey, Pennsylvania. That 600-bed hospital, a teaching hospital, is considered one of the finest in Pennsylvania. In 1918, he also built something else, a cemetery, and that is, in fact, where Milton Hershey was laid to rest when he died in 1945. That wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales About History, except for this one note. Milton Hershey had hired a dairy farmer to be one of his shipping foremen. He had to let him go during a cost-saving campaign, and so that foreman thought he would create his own candy business. His name? H.B. Reese. And yes, he invented Reese's Peanut Butter Cups. Well, Hershey's Corporation would merge with Reese's decades later in 1963. So Reese is again part of the Hershey family enterprise. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Amy Ziegler, Senior Director of the Hershey Story Museum in Hershey, PA. The answer to this week's trivia question: you're familiar with radio call letters like WCBS or KCBS on the West Coast, but what if the call letters were W5DX or NJ1Q? Well, the answer is it would be individual ham radio operators. Next week on Amazing Tales, the American Radio Relay League, a group that has 125 years of fascinating history behind them. Amazing Tales About History is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and stay healthy.